On the morning of November the 6th, 1961, 3 men from the United States Army Corps of Engineers drove a government vehicle up a gravel road in Shannon County, Missouri, and parked at the mouth of a cave that most maps didn't bother to name. They were not lost. They were not exploring. They had a contract number DACW 03-6-1-C-0-119, Little Rock District, and a job that was, on paper, about as ordinary as federal work gets. They were there to measure a room, because that autumn, the United States government had decided that the caves of Missouri were going to save the American people. In September of 1961, the Office of Civil Defense launched the National Fallout Shelter Survey, and the Army Corps of Engineers was assigned to help run it. In Jefferson City, a state engineer named Robert C. Ellis had put a number down on paper that made it all the way to Washington, that the mines and caves of Missouri could shelter 3/4 of everyone living in this state. That December, a retired salesman named John F. Bever, from a Carter County village of 105 people, would write to Senator Stuart Symington to offer up a cave near his house. Wild, undeveloped, running water. Room he estimated for 2,000 to 3,000 people. He asked for the Army Corps by name. That letter is still in the archive. You can read it. So understand what these 3 men were doing at that cave mouth in Shannon County. They weren't hunting anything. They were counting ceiling height for cots, airflow, how many feet of solid rock overhead, how many mothers and children from St. Louis would fit inside when the sirens went. They had a local man with them. His name was Emmett Rowan, 44 years old, born about 6 miles from where he was standing, hired for the day at $1.25 an hour, because he knew the hollow and they did not. Nobody told Emmett Rowan what the survey was for, so he brought his own book. 4 men walked up to that cave on the morning of November the 6th, 1961. By the following spring, the entrance no longer existed. Not gated, not posted, not fenced, filled. The Corps of Engineers went back in with drilling rigs and pumped that opening full of grout until there was nothing left but a seam in the rock and a scar of cleared timber where the equipment had turned around. They have a manual for that. It's numbered, it's published. Anyone can download it. What they don't have, what nobody has been able to get out of them in 64 years, is the report. Because the file for what happened at that cave in November of 1961 does exist. It has a number. It's referenced by other documents that came back clean. And when you request it, you do not get a denial, and you do not get a redaction, and you do not get silence. You get a statute. Title 16, United States Code, Section 4304. The federal government is permitted by law to refuse to tell you the nature and the location of a cave, not the contents of the file. The cave. They may release it to another agency or to a research institution if that institution writes them a letter explaining why it wants to know and promises to keep the answer to itself. A civilian asking where 4 men went in 1961 does not meet the standard. There is one account of what happened inside Bishop Hollow. It is not the Corps. It's a ledger, a hardbound field book, ruled in pencil, that belonged to Emmett Rowan. He kept it because he was a hired man on a government job, and he had been raised to write down what he was paid for. The federal survey forms from that day exist too, and for most of that morning, the 2 documents agree with each other exactly. The times, the depths, the measurements, all of it, line for line, the way 2 honest records should. They agree until 11:40 in the morning. After that, the federal form continues in the same handwriting, in the same clean surveyor's notation for 4 more pages, and closes out the site as surveyed and unsuitable. And Rowan's ledger stops using numbers. There are 9 pages torn out of Emmett Rowan's field book. They were not torn out by the Army Corps of Engineers. I want to be honest with you about what we have and what we don't, because that's the only way any of this is worth your time. We do not have the file. That's the whole reason we're here. What we have is the ledger. It came out of an estate sale in Birch Tree, Missouri, in the winter of 2019. A box lot, farm papers and receipts, and a family Bible. The kind of thing that goes for $4, because nobody at the sale knows what any of it is. The man who bought the box was after the Bible. The ledger was underneath it, and he nearly left it on the table. It's a Federal Supply field book, government issue, the kind the Corps handed to survey crews by the crate in those years. Emmett Rowan's name is inside the front cover in pencil, and under it, in the same hand, the words November Work, Bishop Hollow, Keep. Not kept, keep, an instruction to himself. The first 14 pages are exactly what you'd expect a hired man's field book to be. Weather, hours, what he was owed and whether he'd been paid. A grocery list, the measurements he was helping the Corps men take, copied in his own hand because he didn't trust that $1.25 local would ever see the official version. And he was right, he never did. And then there are the 9 torn pages. And then there is what he wrote after them. Here is what a ledger can tell you and what it can't. It can tell you what one man believed he saw, and when, and in what order. It can tell you where his handwriting got fast and where it got careful, and the one place where it stopped being handwriting at all and became something a man does with a pencil when he is not thinking about the pencil. It cannot tell you whether he was right. I'm not going to tell you he was right. I'm going to tell you what he wrote. And I'm going to tell you what the federal record says next to it. And I'm going to show you every place the two of them agree, because they agree about almost everything. And that's what makes the one place they don't so hard to put down. That's the rule for the next half hour. We have one man's handwriting and one federal file number, and only one of those will answer a letter. Let me take you to Shannon County first, because before any of this, there was just a hollow and a man who knew it, and a country that had suddenly decided his hollow was worth something. If you've never been to Shannon County, I want you to understand how far from everything it is, even now, even today, with the highways. In 1961, it was the far edge of the country's attention. The Current River runs through the middle of it, cold and clear off the springs, and the hills stand up on either side of it in that steep Ozark way where the ridges are close together and the hollows between them are dark by 4 in the afternoon. It is limestone country, dolomite mostly, Cambrian rock, 500 million years old, laid down when this was the floor of a shallow sea, and everywhere that water has been working on that rock for 500 million years, it has made caves. Missouri has more than 7,000 recorded caves. Shannon County has more than most. And those are just the ones somebody wrote down. The people there in 1961 were the children and grandchildren of the men who'd cut the timber. That had been the economy, the great pineries, the tie-hacking, hewing railroad ties by hand out of the short-leaf pine and floating them down the rivers to the landings. But the big timber was gone by then, cut out in the first 30 years of the century, and what it left behind was a county that had been rich for one generation and poor ever since. The young men were leaving, St. Louis mostly, the service if there was a war, and there was always a war coming. The 1960 census put Carter County right next door at 3,973 people, and it had been falling for 40 years. And into a place the country had used up and walked away from, came the strangest piece of good news anybody had heard in a generation. The government wanted the caves. You have to remember what the fall of 1961 felt like. The Berlin Wall had gone up in August. In October, the Soviets tested the largest bomb ever detonated by anyone. Before or since 50 megatons, the Tsar bomber and the Flash was seen 600 miles away. Kennedy had gone on television that summer and told American families to build fallout shelters, and Congress had voted $169 million to survey and stock public shelter space across the country. In today's money, that's better than $1.5 billion. The Office of Civil Defense launched the National Fallout Shelter Survey in September, and they didn't have the manpower to do it alone. So they handed a great deal of it to the people who already knew how to measure the inside of the earth, the Army Corps of Engineers. And in Missouri, the men running civil defense looked at the map, and they looked at 7,000 caves, and they had an idea that must have felt like genius. The state engineer, Robert Ellis, out of Jefferson City, ran the numbers and put them in a federal report. Missouri's caves and mines, he estimated, could shelter 3/4 of the population of the state. 3/4. There is a document in the Missouri State Archives, folder 110, Department of Public Safety, and its title is Missouri Underground Shelter Space, a Fallout Shelter Survey of Mines and Caves in Missouri. It is not a rumor. It is a catalogued government record. They really did go looking cave by cave for rooms to put the survivors in. For a place like Shannon County, this was the future arriving. For the first time since the timber, Washington wanted something that Shannon County had more of than anywhere else. There was going to be federal money and federal work and a reason for the young men to stay. You can hear it in the Bever letter, that retired salesman over in Hunter writing to his United States Senator, not afraid, not suspicious, but hopeful, proud, offering up Lost Man's Cave like a man offering the best of his garden. It could be made into one of the best fallout shelters in Missouri, he wrote, at very small expense. He wanted the Corps to come. Everybody wanted the Corps to come. So when a government car came up the gravel toward Bishop Hollow on the 6th of November, nobody in that country was afraid of it. It was the best thing that had happened in years, which is the part I keep coming back to. Whatever was in that cave, nobody went looking for it. They went looking for a way to save children. Emmett Rowan was not a spelunker, and he was not a soldier, and he was not, whatever the last pages of his ledger might make you think, a superstitious man. I want to build him for you honestly, because the whole thing turns on whether you'll trust him, and you should decide that for yourself. He was born in 1917, about 6 miles up the current from where the cave was, the fourth of 7 children in a family that hacked ties and ran hogs on the open range in the years before the government fenced the forest. He went to the 8th grade, which in that county at that time was a real education, and he could read and cipher better than most grown men around him, which is exactly why he kept books on himself all his life. He married a woman named Vera in 1938. They had 4 children, and they lost one, a boy, to something that a doctor 2 hours away might have fixed. He worked. That's the through line of the man. He worked at the mill when there was a mill. He worked timber when there was timber. He ran a trot line, and he sold the fish. He did a little guiding for the fishing camps when the outsiders started coming for the float trips, and in the fall, he did whatever paid. In November of 1961, what paid was the government. The Corps needed local men. You cannot survey a cave you can't find, and the men from Little Rock could read a topographic map beautifully and could not have located one cave in 50 in that country without somebody who'd grown up walking to them. so they hired. $1.25 an hour, cash, no questions. Show us the ground and hold the other end of the tape. For Rowan, in November, with winter coming and 1 day's federal pay worth more than 3 days of anything else on offer, it was not a decision. It was a gift. Here is the thing I need you to hold on to about Emmett Rowan, because it explains everything he did and everything he didn't do that day. He was a hired man. That meant something specific in that country in that year. It meant you did the work and you did not ask what the work was for. It meant that when the government man told you to hold here and mark there, you held and you marked, and you did not offer your opinion, because your opinion was not what the $1.25 was buying. It meant that if you saw something the government man didn't see or didn't want to see, you kept it behind your teeth, not because you were afraid of him, but because that was the shape of the arrangement, and men like Rowan kept the shape of the arrangement the way they kept the Sabbath. But it also meant something else. It meant you kept your own book, because a hired man learns young that the official record is written by the man who's paying, and the man who's paying can always decide later that he doesn't owe you, or that you weren't there, or that it didn't happen the way you remember. So you write it down yourself, your hours, your pay, what you did, and what you saw. Not to argue with anybody, Rowan never showed that ledger to a living soul that we know of, but because a man's own account of his own day is the one thing they can't take off him. That's why we have this at all. Not because Emmett Rowan was a mystic, because he was careful and poor and proud, and he had learned the hard way to keep the receipts. So on the morning of the 6th, he put on his coat and his boots, and he put a government field book in his pocket that the Corps had handed him for the official measurements, and somewhere in the same pocket. Or maybe it was the same book with his own pages ruled in the back. He kept his own count going too. And for the first 2 hours, his count and theirs are the same book. I've read enough Corps survey documents from that program to tell you almost exactly what that morning looked like, because the work was standardized and dull, and it is dull in Rowan's ledger too, right up until it isn't. They were assessing the cave as fallout shelter space, and that assessment came down to a few clinical questions. First, and most important, mass shielding. Fallout protection is a function of how much matter stands between the people inside and the radioactive dust outside, and rock is excellent matter. So they measured overburden, the thickness of the stone ceiling, because every foot of dolomite over your head cuts the radiation by a known amount, and the survey needed to certify a protection factor, a number that said how many times safer you were inside than out. Bishop Hollow going in looked promising, a deep cave in thick rock, good numbers on the approach. Second, capacity. How many people fit? This is grimmer than it sounds when you read the forms, because capacity meant cots, and cots meant floor area at a minimum standing height. And so the men walked the cave with a tape and a clinometer, and they turned the inside of the earth into square footage. So many people here, so many there. The Corps standard was 10 square feet a person. Rowan's ledger has the running totals in his own hand, and you can watch him doing the arithmetic in the margin, and the number he's building toward, the number for the whole cave, is a little over 2,000. 2,000 people. That was the answer they were reaching for. That was the room they were measuring. Third, the practical business of keeping 2,000 people alive underground for 2 weeks. Airflow, a cave has to breathe or the air goes bad, and they measured the draft at the entrance and the throat. Water. Was there a source? Was it clean? Would it flood? Ceiling height for the cots, floor for the latrines, a place for the sick, a place for the stores. It reads, in the federal notation exactly like what it was. Men doing sober, decent, methodical work, trying to figure out how to save the maximum number of ordinary Americans from the worst thing anyone could imagine. And Rowan's book keeps right up with them. Same times, same depths, same clinometer readings, transcribed careful and correct. When Voss, that was the lead man, the core geologist, Raymond Voss, when Voss called out a measurement, Rowan wrote it, and it matches the federal form to the inch. They agree on the entrance chamber. They agree on the first passage. They agree on the drop into the second chamber and the wet crawl beyond it. And they agree on the readings in the big room past the crawl, which is where the good capacity numbers were, which is where the whole cave started to look like exactly the shelter the state was praying for. They agree on everything until 11:40 in the morning. At 11:40, by Rowan's own clock, the overburden number stopped making sense. I need to explain this carefully because it's the first crack, and it's the kind of crack a reasonable man can talk himself out of, which is exactly why it matters that Rowan wrote it down instead of talking himself out of it. When you measure a cave for shielding, you're measuring two things and checking them against each other. You measure the depth of the passage as you go in, how far below the surface you've descended, using the clinometer and the tape and the slope of the floor. And you can also estimate, from the surface topography, how much rock should be over your head at any given point, because you know the shape of the hill from the map. In an honest cave, in ordinary rock, those two numbers move together. As you go deeper into the hill, the ceiling gets thicker over you, and both methods agree on by how much. That agreement is the whole basis of the shielding certification. It's routine. It closes every time. In the big room, past the wet crawl, it didn't close. The depth Voss and Rowan measured going in said they were at a certain point under the hill. The overburden that point should have had, the thickness of rock the surface map said stood over that spot, was one number, and the readings they were taking inside the room said the rock over their heads was thicker than that, not by a little, by enough that Voss stopped and ran it again. Rowan's ledger, at 11:40, the first figure struck through, the second figure written next to it, and then, and this is the detail I can't get past, a third figure in Rowan's hand, not Voss's notation at all. That is larger than both. Rowan measured it himself, on his own, off his own count, without being asked. A hired man does not do that. A hired man holds the tape where he's told and writes what he's given. But something about that room made Emmett Rowan take his own reading of how much rock was over his head, and the reading he got was that there was more mountain above that room than the mountain was tall. He didn't say anything. There's no note that he said anything. The federal form doesn't record any of this. The federal form takes the second number, the corrected one, and moves on. And honestly, you can see why. Because the reasonable explanation is right there. The map's wrong, or the survey drifted, or the clinometer's off, or the floor sloped in a way they didn't log. Caves are hard to measure. Numbers don't close sometimes. A professional shrugs and reshoots and takes the better reading and gets on with the day. And that is precisely what Raymond Voss did. And I will not stand here and tell you he was a fool for it, because he wasn't. But Emmett Rowan wrote down all three numbers, and in the margin next to them, he ruled a narrow column of his own. The ledger is full of his little ruled columns. It's how his mind worked, and he headed this one with a single question mark. And under the question mark, that day he made 4 marks. 4 small entries, spaced out through what was left of the morning. We'll get to what the 4 marks were. The first one is at 11:40, and the first one is just this, in his cramped, careful pencil. Rock don't add up. ER read it twice. More over us than the hill has got. Now, before I take you any further into that cave, I owe you the other side, because I don't want you thinking I've forgotten it, and I don't want you thinking Emmett Rowan forgot it either. He didn't. The ledger is the record of a practical man trying all afternoon to explain what he was seeing in ordinary terms and running out of ordinary terms one at a time. Let's do it with him. Let's kill the reasonable explanations the way he did, out loud, in order. Start with the simplest. Bad air. Caves can kill you with air. Carbon dioxide pools in low chambers, odorless, and it makes you stupid before it makes you dead. Confusion, poor judgment, the sensation that the room is wrong, hallucination at the edges. A crew getting woozy on foul air in a deep chamber would absolutely start misreading their instruments and mistrusting their own eyes. It is the first thing a cave professional thinks of, and the first thing they'd think of here. Except the Corps was measuring the air. That was part of the survey, airflow and quality, because you can't shelter 2,000 people in a room that suffocates them. Their own readings were normal. The draft was moving. The federal form logs, breathable air in the big room, and Rowan's ledger doesn't argue with it. Whatever was wrong with that room, the air was fine. The men were not drunk on carbon dioxide. The instruments say so, and the instruments have no reason to lie. Bears. This is Ozark Cave country, and the honest first thought of any local at a strange sign in a cave is an animal. But Missouri in 1961 had almost no black bears. They'd been hunted and driven out of the state by the early 20th century. The population that's here now was largely restocked later, out of Arkansas. In 1961, in Shannon County, a bear was nearly as unlikely as anything else in this story. And Rowan knew that better than we do. He was a hogman and a hunter, and he'd have known bear sign from anything else on Earth. And if he'd thought it was a bear, the ledger would say bear, because bear is a thing a hired man can write down without anybody thinking he's soft. He didn't write bear. A still. Now this is the real one, and Rowan raises it himself, because this is the answer the country actually had for strangers have been in a cave they shouldn't be in. Moonshine. The hollows were full of stills in those years, tucked back in exactly the kind of remote, wet cave nobody surveys, and a bootlegger protecting his operation is a genuinely dangerous thing and a genuinely ordinary one. If Rowan found sign that men had been living and working back in that cave, that's your whole mystery solved, and it solves it in a way that keeps every spooky thing firmly in the world of the real. Rowan clearly thought about it. There's a line about it, and then there's the line that kills it, and I'll only tell you the shape of it now. Whatever had been in that room hadn't been distilling anything, and hadn't been a man, and the reason he was sure wasn't a feeling. It was physical, and it was on the walls, and we'll come to it. A second party in the cave, other cavers, kids, somebody camped back in there. Killed by the survey itself. The Corps mapped the entrances. That was the first thing they did, because the shelters got to be sealable and countable. Bishop Hollow had one way in. One. The federal form says so and signs it. Nobody was in that cave who hadn't come through the front behind Emmett Rowan, and Emmett Rowan was watching the front. And the last ordinary explanation, the one that covers everything, the one a skeptic reaches for when the others fall. Somebody's lying. Rowan made it up, or misremembered it years later, or built a spooky story into an old field book for reasons of his own. And I can't disprove that to you. I genuinely can't. But I'll give you the one fact that makes me doubt it, and it's the same fact that runs under this whole account. The ledger and the federal record agree. Everywhere they can be checked against each other, they check out. The times, the depths, the crew, the weather, the contract, the fact that a survey happened at Bishop Hollow on that date at all. A man inventing a horror story doesn't spend 14 pages getting the boring parts exactly, verifiably right. The two documents track each other perfectly, like two honest men telling the same true morning, and then they diverge at one moment and only one, and after that moment, one of them keeps counting and the other one stops. That's the thing I can't explain away, not the fear, the precision of where the fear starts. So let me take you to where it starts. The second mark under Rowan's question mark comes about an hour after the first, and it's about the water. There's a stream in the back of that cave. There usually is in Ozark caves. That's what carved them, and it runs out through the throat and down the hollow, cold spring water, and the Corps logged it as a potential supply, which is good news for a shelter. Rowan's second mark is about which way it was running. He writes that the water in the deep room was running the wrong way, toward the back, uphill by his red, away from the entrance, and deeper into the hill, when every drop of water in that country runs down toward the current. Now, there are real ways that can happen. Cave streams do strange things. They siphon, they run under the floor and surface again. A cave can have water going what looks like uphill because the real slope is hidden. Voss surely had an explanation, and it was surely reasonable. But Rowan stood there and watched water run away from the light, back into the dark, and he ruled a second mark, and next to it, he wrote 4 words. Creeks going in, feeding. Feeding, that's his word. Not draining, feeding. The third mark is the dogs, except there weren't any dogs, and that's the point of the third mark. Rowan had a dog. Everybody in that country had dogs, and a hunting man's dog goes where the man goes, and that dog had been up that hollow with Rowan 100 times. That morning, the dog came to the tree line above the cave mouth and stopped and would not come down. Rowan called it, and it wouldn't come. That's the whole of the third mark, and it's such a small thing, and if it stood alone, I'd tell you a dog is a dog, and dogs are strange. But it doesn't stand alone. It stands third, in a column, after the rock that didn't add up, and the water that fed, and Rowan didn't write it, because a dog balked. He wrote it because when the dog balked, Emmett Rowan understood the dog. That's the line. Dog won't come. Dog's got the sense I ain't got. And then there's the sound, which is where the reasonable afternoon ends. I've held one thing back from you, and it's the thing all of this was circling. In the deep room, the room where the rock didn't add up and the water fed backward, there was a sound. It was low. It was under the range of a thing you hear. It was more the kind of thing you feel in the long bones, the way you feel a big truck before it comes around the bend. The Corps men noticed it too. Even the federal form, even Voss's clean, unbothered notation, has a note about a low-frequency resonance, source undetermined, likely airflow through constricted passage. Likely airflow. There's your reasonable explanation right there in the government's own hand, and it's a good one. Wind through a narrow cave, throat can moan, can boom, can do all kinds of things. The whole world of cave acoustics is full of sounds that fool you. Except Rowan's fourth mark, the last one under the question mark, and is the only one where his handwriting changes, where the careful, cramped pencil that got 14 pages exactly right goes fast and hard and presses through to the next page. He writes that the sound kept time. He writes that it wasn't wind because wind doesn't keep time, and this kept time, slow, steady, spaced out even, and that the spacing was the spacing of something breathing, something big enough that a breath took a while. And he writes, And this is the last thing in the ledger that's a full, clear sentence. Before the 9 torn pages, he writes, "It ain't the wind. Wind don't wait to see, are you listening? This waited. Then it done it again." Here is where I have to tell you what I don't have. I don't have the 9 pages. Nobody does. They were torn out of that ledger by Emmett Rowan's own hand. You can see the stubs. You can see they were pulled deliberately and not lost. And you can see from the pressure marks carried through onto the pages beneath that he wrote them fast and wrote them hard and then took them out of the book. Whatever happened in the last part of that day in Bishop Hollow, Emmett Rowan wrote it down, the way he wrote everything down, and then he decided that this was the one thing in his life that he would not keep the receipt on. He tore it out. And what he tore out, he never told, and Vera never told, if she ever knew, and it went into the ground with both of them. So I can't give you the middle of it. I can only give you the edges, because the edges are in the record, in the federal file's cold aftermath, in the county's paper, in the one page Rowan let stand on the far side of the tear. What the edges tell us is this. 4 men went into Bishop Hollow on the morning of November the 6th, 1961. The survey was scheduled as a one-day job and it ended early. The federal form's own timestamps show the crew coming out well before the light would have gone, hours before a survey of that size should have wrapped. They came out fast, and they did not all come out. The federal form closes the site at 1400 hours 2 in the afternoon, as surveyed unsuitable for shelter designation. Unsuitable after a morning of numbers that were making it look like exactly the shelter the state wanted. The cave that could hold 2,000 was, by 2 o'clock, unsuitable, and the survey was closed, and the crew was out. And on the one page that Emmett Rowan let stand, the first page after the tear, where his handwriting has gone quiet again, quiet in a way that's worse than the fast writing, there is no account of what happened. He wouldn't give us that. There's just this, and it's the only thing on the page, and I'll read it to you exactly. Come out with 3. Went in with 4. Mr. Voss says 3. Form says 3. I signed it, says 3. God forgive me. I signed it, says 3. And there was 4, and I knowed his name, and I ain't gonna write it, because if I write it they'll say he wasn't ever there, and he was there, and he had a wife. That's it. That's the far side of the tear. Went in with 4, came out with 3, and the federal record, the form Emmett Rowan put his own name to, because a hired man signs what he's told to sign, the federal record says the crew was 3. Not that a man was lost, that the crew was 3, as if the 4th had never been counted at all. There is one more thing on that page, at the very bottom, and it's the physical thing. The thing that's kept me from being able to write this off. The thing I keep coming back to at night. Rowan brought something out of that cave. Not a body. There was no body. That's the whole horror of the count. That's why the form could say 3, because there was nothing to say otherwise. What Rowan carried out was smaller. He'd been holding the tape at the end in the deep room. And when whatever happened, and the men ran, the tape was still in his hand, and a piece of the cave came with it. A piece of the wall, about the size of a fist, he says. It had come off the wall of the deep room where the sound was, where the water fed, and he had it in his coat pocket when he came out into the light, and he didn't know he had it until he got home. And here's what he wrote about the piece of the wall, and it's the last line in the ledger, and after it there is nothing, just blank government paper to the back cover. The rock is warm, been 3 days, house is cold, rock is warm, it ain't stopped being warm. A piece of dolomite, Cambrian rock, 500 million years cold from the back of an unheated cave in November, in an unheated house. 3 days later, warm. We don't have the rock either. Of course we don't. I wish we did. I'd have handed it to a geologist so fast, and they'd have told me it was nothing, some ordinary mineral, some trick of a frightened man's memory, and I'd have been glad to hear it. But the rock isn't in the box. The Bible was in the box, and the ledger was under the Bible, and the 9 pages were already gone, and the rock was already gone, and all that's left is a poor, careful, honest man's pencil telling us that the last thing he brought out of the ground at Bishop Hollow wouldn't go cold. That's everything Emmett Rowan gave us. Now let me tell you what the government did. The Register of Deaths for Shannon County, Missouri, for the winter of 1961 into 1962 is a public document. I've been through it. There is no entry in it for a man lost in a cave in November. There's no inquest, no coroner's finding, no missing person notice in the current local or the county paper that any survey has ever turned up. By every official record that exists, no one died at Bishop Hollow, because by every official record that exists, the crew that went in was 3 men, and 3 men came out, and the arithmetic is closed and clean, and there is no 4th man to account for. If a 4th man was on that crew, he has left almost no trace, which in 1961 in a county that poor was not hard. A hired local, cash, no paper, a family that would have been told he'd left for St. Louis, or the service, or just left, the way men did leave. A wife who waited and then stopped waiting. It is one of the quiet horrors of a poor place that a man can be subtracted from it, and the place will close over the gap like water. Here's what does have a paper trail. The following spring, the record is consistent on this even where it's thin. The Corps came back to Bishop Hollow, not to survey, to close it. And this is where all that dull grouting research earns its keep, because the technical vocabulary of sealing a cave is real. It's published, and it is exactly as clinical as this moment needs. The Army Corps of Engineers seals karst voids for a living. They've done it at Clearwater Dam, 40 miles from Bishop Hollow, for decades, 840 boreholes along one embankment, low mobility grout and high mobility grout pumped into dolomite to fill the voids the water made. They have an engineer manual for it, EM1110-2-3506, with tables of grout mixes and schematics of cave-type features, and it reads like what it is, a numbered, professional, unbothered method for making a cave stop being a cave. Downstage grouting, void filling, epicast treatment. The Corps could seal Bishop Hollow in its sleep, and in the spring of 1962, it did. But here is the number. Here is the one number in the whole federal aftermath that I cannot make lie flat, and I'm going to give it to you, and then I'm going to leave it alone, because it does its work best if I don't touch it. When you fill a void, you know how much you filled. You have to, the grout is metered, it's pumped, it's measured to the gallon, because that's how you certify the void is full and how you bill for the material. The volume of grout that goes in tells you the volume of the space that was there, and the morning survey, Rowan's measurements, and the Corps' own. In perfect agreement, the good clean numbers from before 1140, the morning survey told them the volume of Bishop Hollow, how big the room was, how much air, enough for 2,000 people at 10 square feet each. They measured it. It's on the form. The volume they filled was larger than the volume they measured. More grout went into that cave than the cave, by its own certified survey, could hold. I'll let you sit with that the way I've had to. So that's the record. A ledger that agrees with the government about everything but one man and one number. A county register with a man-shaped hole in it that the arithmetic has sealed over. A cave filled with more of itself than there was room for. And a rock that wouldn't go cold, that we don't have, that we'll never have. And the file. I told you at the start that the file exists, and it does. Federal record keeping in 1961 was thorough, and a core survey under a contract number DACW 03-61-C-0119 generates paper, and that paper is referenced, indexed, cross-filed against other surveys in the same program that have been released clean, that anyone can read, that sit in the archive being boring. The Bishop Hollow file is referenced by those documents. It is real. It has a number. You cannot read it. And I want to be precise with you about why, because the precise reason is stranger and more interesting than the word classified. And if I told you it was stamped top secret, I'd be lying to you, and you'd catch me, and you'd be right to. It isn't classified in that sense. A cave survey isn't a nuclear secret. What it is withheld, and it's withheld by a law, a real law, that most people have never heard of, and that does something genuinely unsettling once you understand it. Title 16 of the United States Code, Section 4304. It's part of the Federal Cave Resources Protection Act of 1988, and its own heading is Confidentiality of Information Concerning Nature and Location of Significant Caves. It is a recognized, published exemption to the Freedom of Information Act. And what it says, in plain effect, is this. The federal government is permitted by law to refuse to tell you where a cave is or what's in it. Not to protect a secret in the ordinary sense, the law was written to protect fragile caves from vandals and looters, and that's a real and good purpose. But the mechanism is the mechanism. The government may withhold the nature and the location of a significant cave from any ordinary citizen who asks. They'll release it, but only to another government agency or to a bona fide educational or research institution. And only if that institution writes them a formal request that describes the specific cave, explains exactly why it wants to know, and gives assurances satisfactory to the secretary that it will keep the answer secret too. Read that again and think about what it means for our purposes. A private person cannot legally compel the United States to say where a particular cave is, or what its records contain, if the government decides that a cave is significant. The request I would have to file to see the Bishop Hollow file is a request that, by the plain text of the statute, I do not have standing to make. I am not an agency. I am not an institution. I am a man asking where 4 other men went in 1961. And the law has a word for a man like that, and the word is no. They don't have to deny it happened. They don't have to redact a page. They just have to point at section 4304. And the cave itself, the hole in the ground where Emmett Rowan lost a count, he carried the rest of his life. The cave is, by act of Congress, none of your business. I'll leave you with 3 things, and then I'll leave you alone. The first is a date, July of 2021, 60 years after Bishop Hollow, almost to the season. On Fort Leonard Wood, 100 miles northwest in Pulaski County, the United States Army permanently closed a cave. Miller Cave, a real place, a beautiful one, above the Big Piney River, with rock art in it 1,000 years old. The Army closed it after some vandals got at the art, and closing it was the right thing to do. But read how they did it. They didn't just gate it. Per the Army's own announcement, they removed the signs. Every sign that pointed to the cave including the educational markers that had stood since the 1990s explaining what the place was, all taken down. The goal wasn't only to keep people out, it was to make people stop knowing it was there. 60 years apart, the same institution, the same instinct. A cave in Missouri becomes a problem, and the answer is not to explain it, but to erase the fact that it was ever worth pointing at. That's not a conspiracy. That's just what the record shows they do. The second is the ledger itself, and the 9 torn pages. And I want to be fair to Emmett Rowan one last time. He was not a man who scared easy or lied for sport. He kept books on himself his whole life because he'd learned that the official version is written by whoever's paying, and a poor man's only defense is his own honest account. And this one day, was the only time in that whole careful life that he wrote the truth down and then decided the world could not have it. He didn't burn the book. He kept it 40 years, keep, written in his own hand inside the cover. But he tore out the middle. He let us have the rock that wouldn't cool, and the count that wouldn't close, and the sound that kept time. And he took out the 9 pages where he must have written what it was, and he took them out, not to protect the government, who he plainly never forgave, but I think to protect us, or his own soul, or the name of the 4th man who had a wife. He decided some things a man should not pass on, and he made that decision alone, in a cold house, holding a warm rock, and he stuck to it until he died. The third thing is the one I actually want to leave you with. The core sealed Bishop Hollow, 1 cave. They pumped it full and cleared the timber, and the maps forgot it, and the law keeps the file, and that's the end of that one. But Missouri has more than 7,000 recorded caves, and recorded is the key word, because the ones on the survey are the ones somebody wrote down, and every old family in that country knows a hole in a hillside that nobody ever wrote down at all. Most of those caves are on private land. They always were, and somewhere in the Ozarks tonight, there is an old man or an old woman who was told once by a grandfather, by an uncle, by a hired man who came home from a government job in the winter of '61 and was never quite right after. Told, plainly, which hollow you fish and which hollow you hunt, and which one, the deep one, the one where the creek runs the wrong way, you do not go in. Not because of a ghost story, because somebody they trusted counted 4 going in and 3 coming out, and signed the paper that said 3 and carried it the rest of his life. If you're from that country, if your people are Ozark people, and there's a cave in your family that you were told to leave alone, and you were never told why, I'd like to hear about it, because the government has 1 cave and a number and a law that keeps you from reading it. But the people who never trusted the government to begin with, they kept their own books, the way Emmett Rowan did.